Hello, and I would like to say good evening, afternoon, and perhaps morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia. I'm speaking this evening on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape. I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. For the past 28 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, what we call IRAAS, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility in Black studies. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and in New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our fairly new Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, what we call AAADS, IRAAS continues to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience with ongoing series like Conversations. So again, I want to welcome you all to tonight's Conversations, Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being, by Dr. Kevin Quashie, in dialogue with Dr. SAIDIYA HARTMAN and Dr. Robert Gooding Williams. Now, I should say this event was originally supposed to happen in November and was delayed from the fall because we stood in solidarity with the strike undertaken by the student workers of Columbia University. This event is also co-sponsored with the Center for Ethnicity and Race and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society here at Columbia University. And so it is great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Kevin Quashie, who is a professor of Black Cultural and Literary Studies in the Department of English at Brown University. Dr. Quashie's scholarship on Black feminism, Black queer studies, and aesthetics has been published in numerous journals, among them Meridians, Differences, Anthurium, and The Black Scholar. He is the author or editor of 4 books, including Black Women, Identity and Cultural Theory, Unbecoming the Subject of 2004, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, 2012, and most recently, and our focus tonight, Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being, 2021. A beautiful provocation, Black Aliveness invites us to imagine a Black world. Kevin engages each text, each poem, with such great affection and care that you cannot but help follow his thoughtful pedagogy and study. He leads me and us towards a Blackness, or as he writes, quote, an aliveness as a fuller habitat for being in regard to one's being, quote. So we'll hear more about this. Joining Kevin in conversation this evening are my colleagues, Dr. SAIDIYA Hartman, who is a university professor and a professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. Dr. Hartman is the author of Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, and her most recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. She's published numerous essays on photography, film, feminism, and aesthetics, and is beginning a project on photography and ethics. We will also be joined by Dr. Robert Gooding Williams, who is joint appointed in the philosophy department and the African American and African Diaspora Studies, where he is also a founding director of the Center for Race, Philosophy, and Social Justice. He is the author of Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism, Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics, and In the Shadow of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America. Professor Gooden has written extensively in publications like Public Culture and Du Bois Review, and is currently undertaking a project of Du Bois on Du Bois's writings on aesthetics. So we'll begin this evening with a short presentation by Kevin, followed by a conversation with SAIDIYA and Bob. We will open the Q&A toward the end of this event, so please write your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your Zoom window. Please do not leave them in the chat, but actually it's easier for us to access your questions and keep track of them if you use the Q&A. So I'm going to now turn this over to Dr. Kevin Quashie.
Thank you, Mabel Wilson, SAIDIYA Hartman, Robert Gooding Williams, Sharon Harris for doing the work to make this happen, and the interpreters and other folks who are managing technical aspects of this event, and to all of you here. I hope you are well and safe. And thank you, Mabel, especially for that kind introduction. Let me say a couple brief things, during which I will also read a poem and then a few paragraphs from the work on Black aliveness. In thinking about Black aliveness, I didn't want to talk about Black life, since there is nothing to be said about life, since life is too complicated to withstand the syntax of saying, since Black life in particular is too tangled with and mangled by the rhetorics and violences of subjection, as Professor Hartman has argued, or as Nahum Chandler reminds us, we cannot pretend to speak of these things. I wanted instead to explore aliveness as an idea or a practice or an invocation or an evocation or an inspiration or overture that is manifest in Black art, particularly Black literature. Of course, to behold this aliveness requires that we orient ourselves differently to how we read and how we think about the dynamics of reading Black literature. Doing this means inhabiting another register for Black thought beyond or next to the discourses of Black death. As such, then, I'm trying to ignite another inflection of Black thought beyond the terms that death often makes for how we think about Blackness. As Mabel Wilson then said, I start with that wish phrase, imagine a Black world. I do this as a sly attempt to try to bypass the heft of the urgency, even the insurgency of an anti-Black social world, as if to say that to read a Black text is to be able to imagine a Black world, to try to stay suspended in a Black world. For me, that phrase, imagine a Black world, is the offer that Black literature makes to the reader, the Black reader particularly. It's an orienting and reorienting of the Black reader as both a subject and object in relation with the work, which is itself a world. I'm interested in the quality of aliveness, notable in the world-making aesthetics of poems and essays, in how those poems and essays can be read for what they tell us about our being, about how we are, and about how we can be. I'm interested both in the ways that the world of Black text constitutes our rightness of being, as I am interested also in the ethical implications for such a constituting. I should pause and say that when I say our, I mean in particular, in this particular instance, Black folks, but I don't mean that as an excluding gesture of non-Black readers. It is just the case that in this project, I wanted to try to stay with the line of thought that helps around the idea of imagining a Black reader, imagining the Black text as a Black world. I try then in the book to make a case for an idea of aliveness through relation, through phenomenology, and toward the conceptualization of oneness, of a Black oneness. I pursue that idea of oneness through Black women's writing and its moments of audacious declarations of being, as in Lucille Clifton's speaker saying, "I had no model," or the feminist anthology proclaiming, "All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave." These and other lyric idealizations of a Black female speaker's speaking as a site of philosophical possibility and deliberation are part of the work I try to do in the book. I read these declarations, it's important to say, not through the bankrupt notion of the individual. Individualism is a bankrupt idea, and it is incompatible with Black life in an anti-Black world. And indeed, the idea of aliveness I'm interested in thinking about is relational, not individual. So I read these declarations not as individual, but as instances of first-person being used to sustain the concept of oneness, of one's right to be a one. For me, this pronoun, one, that personal, impersonal pronoun, which gestures to the idea of being both subject and object, this pronoun, one, is the syntax through which a person might philosophize or conceptualize being and becoming. I then use this idea of oneness. I'm realizing I'm trying to efficiently summarize some of the moves in the work so I can get to a poem. I then use this idea of oneness to think about the ethical. That is, there's an ethical confrontation to be had for a Black reader in a Black text. Said another way, rather than the anti-Black world's non-relational disavowal of Black ethicality, a Black world habitat can offer a space for ethical figuring. I'll come back to this point in a minute. To commence this thinking then, I turn first and regularly to Lucille Clifton, first to her untitled poem named Reply, which I can't not bring into this space today. This poem that starts with a harsh and ugly request. It is an untitled poem, but it often goes by the name Reply. The paratext reads, from a letter written to Dr. W.B. Du Bois by Alvin Borquest of Clark University in Massachusetts on April 3rd, 1905. Quote, we are pursuing an investigation here on the subject of crying as an expression of the emotions, and should like very much to learn about its peculiarities among the colored people. We have been referred to you as a person competent to give us information on the subject. We desire especially to know about the following salient aspects. 1, whether the Negro sheds tears. Reply. He do, she do. They live, they love. They try, they tire. They flee, they fight. They bleed, they break. They moan, they mourn. They weep, they die. They do, They do. They do. This poem is majestic in its poetics. And though I won't rehearse here all of what I say in the work, I can't not note the dancing waltz of the anaphora, as if this is a drum or heartbeat of paired stressed syllables, how this sequence creates a deliberate formation in what looks otherwise like a random gathering of actions, such that live precedes and parallels love, moan, yields to mourn. These and other instances of rhyme manifest something larger than a simple catalog. They are, I think, world-making. I also talk about how the poem speaker directs us where to look and assumes that we can and will know how to look rightly. How Clifton's use of the objectification of the third person case relishes in distance and plurality. He, she, they. In this way, looking is something that the reader does in concert with the speaker's prudent guidance. Look at this, the speaker seems to intone. And as such, the speaker reorients the practice of looking beyond its destructive intent to secure racial difference and Black inhumanity. Notice that the speaker doesn't say we, but instead stands as an MC, as a host who seems to revel in what it is to look at all this quotidian magnificence rendered via the expansive line of words ambling down the page like a staircase or waterfall or slideshow of being and after being, linked in that beautiful music and gesturing toward what cannot be fully said, since, after all, it is not possible to present every instance of Black being, not possible to house every instance of Black being in a pantheon, or to map it in the sky or track it all over the edge of the earth. In eliding the pronoun we, Clifton's speaker not only refuses to orient via or against the hateful question in the paratext, but the speaker unfurls a world. These are world-making acts, I think. This is a world-making poem. Notice how the poem's time register moves towards infinity of the last three lines, which mimic the orthography of ellipses. They do, they do, they do, like dot, dot, dot. That poem then sets up the work I try to do with Black Aliveness. I'm almost done. I promised to come back to the ethical, so let me read one paragraph and then I'll read from the end very quickly. This is from the 5th chapter of the book, where I try to think about aliveness and the ethical. One can only undertake the ethical in a context where orientation remains open, such as the relationality constituted in a text's invocation of a Black world. That is, the question, how am I being, becoming, cannot be figured through the terms of worth and value on which anti-Blackness is predicated. Simply, every Black one is already worthy since they are on earth, and worth is a human legacy. And embedded in this claim is the companion notion that every human being is called on to manifest their worth, to believe it, to act of its accord, to negotiate its parameters and fall short of its obligation over and again. This is what might be called grace, the work of trying every day to be engaged in an investigation of one's being. I know that the historical denigration of Blackness troubles any suggestion that one has to reckon with or earn one's worth. And still, the invitation to reckon must be countenanced without being anchored to the ideology of Black non-value. Reckon we must, since the reckoning with being human is ours to bear. Here I turn to Baldwin, who says, our humanity is our burden. We need not battle for it. We need only to do what is infinitely more difficult, that is, accept it. One does not have to display one's reckoning to another, so has to have it be verified or confirmed. One does not have to be of a certain manner or tethered to a normative idea of what constitutes ethical encounter. One must reckon over and again. And for me, the permissiveness of the Black world, of the Black text, the permissiveness that the Black text makes through its world offers that. I'll take one more minute. This is how then the book ends. Aliveness is the repertoire of having an ethical orientation in a world that is not ethically oriented. Aliveness is the repertoire of having an ethical orientation in a world that is not ethically oriented. We are not the idea of us, not even the idea that we hold of us. We are us, multiple and varied, becoming the heterogeneity of us. Blackness in a Black world is everything, which means that it gets to be freed from being any one thing. We are ordinary beauty, Black people, and beauty must be allowed to do its beautiful work. We do not live in a Black world, this is true. But the as if of such imagining can inspire how we might navigate the world that we indeed live in, the one that is anti-Black and that resists and resents and despises our being. We do not live in a Black world, but in a poem, there's an orientation of such being waiting for us. These poems in our hands as a world of invitation. This being is poetic, and we are of its aliveness. So, my dears, that is some of the work I try to do in the work. And now I will stop screen sharing so that I might be joined by Professor Hartman and Professor Gooden-Williams.
Well, I have so many questions. You know, as I mentioned earlier, SAIDIYA and I had the good fortune of teaching your book in a course we co-taught last semester, and it was quite exciting and very engaging for our students. But one of the things that engaged me was you've touched on this today, is precisely your reflection on the relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical. And the category that kept coming to mind again and again was the category of aesthetic education. And in that connection, I was thinking of Friedrich Schiller, of Matthew Arnold, but also of Du Bois, and more recently of Fred Moten. And the idea that we can think of aesthetic education as serving various purposes. I think Arnold said that aesthetic education has a social vocation. Schiller thinks of aesthetic education as having a moral and political vocation. I think so too does Du Bois. And for you, if I'm reading you correctly, aesthetic education has an ethical vocation. And I hope one of the things we're able to talk about as we proceed is your conception of the ethical. But I thought I would start off, especially since you opened by kind of summarizing, your really brilliant reading of that Clifton poem. I thought we might begin our discussion by asking you to say something about the literary critical practice of close reading.
Mm.
and how it is that you see close reading as facilitating aesthetic education. How is it? I mean, you've touched on this a bit already, but I wonder if you could say a bit more. I mean, how is it that actually learning to read well, maybe, hoping to learn to read as well as you read, how is it that cultivating that literary critical, that shall we say aesthetic capacity can, as it were, have, forgive the metaphor, ethical dividends? I mean, how do I get from being a good close reader to the ethical, which is the point, the purpose of as I read you in any case, the purpose of engaging in close reading to begin with. Because you might think, well, okay, I learned to read a poem well, and so and to a more conventional view might be, and to kind of appreciate it, if I'm a person of taste, I read the poem, and the upshot is a certain aesthetic pleasure, and then I go about my business. But you want to say something more, that close reading, can make a difference to the way in which I live my life. And so I guess what I'm inviting you to do is to say more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I smiled as you were talking, because I think in a way maybe you've anticipated the thing I'm trying to work on now, which might mean maybe the thing I'm trying to work on now might not need to be written. In The Shadow of Du Bois, you use a phrase regularly that I love. Use the phrase "politics of expressive self-realization," and even though I think I went back through it, I don't think you ever modify the phrase to say an aesthetics of expressive self-realization. But as you are tracking Du Bois's deployment of the genre of political thought, you're also tracking his encounter with the aesthetics of what it means to have an encounter of self-realization. So that's one thing I might say. And this, I'm hoping I can connect these things. I think about SAIDIYA Hartman's the third or the fifth chapter of Lose Your Mother, the Dead Book, where the speaker in that instance is trying to figure out, how do I read these scraps and these stories? And there's this profound impact on the speaker, because ultimately, unfortunately, there's nothing to be done for the killed Black girl in that chapter. There's nothing to be done, unfortunately. But what can be done is the kind of transformation or orientation that happens for the speaker who's trying to figure out, well, what do I do with this? So those are two responses. I think there is in Black cultural and maybe specifically literary tradition, Horton Spillers talks about this when she talks about the sermon. There is something about going to the word as a way to figure out what are you supposed to do in the world? There's something about, right, being moved by the word. Her essay, Moving On Down the Line, is this brilliant thinking about the sermon, where she says, amongst the many things she says, the striking thing about the force of the sermon is that no one has any doubt about the conclusion the sermon will reach. The sermon will always reach the conclusion of the triumph of the dispossessed and marginalized, right? Of the ascendance of the kind of goodness that the world would to kill. And yet, even in spite of that, if one surrenders to the sermon, there's this way in which it enacts a kind of transformation of the one who is encountering those words, reading those words. She calls the hearers of the sermon readers, even though they are, we would say, hearing it. And maybe the last thing I'll say by way of trying to connect this is Jennifer Nash has a great essay called Writing Black Beauty. And in that essay, she is trying to sit with some contemporary Black critical theorists, Black women critical theorists, whose writing is, I'm going to use the word stylish, but I'm going to come back and clarify what I mean by it, whose writing stylishly tries to do its difficult theoretical work. And by stylish, stylish is the word I'm using. By stylish, I don't mean, and certainly she doesn't mean, merely a quality of poetic elegance. I think she means, and I mean, a sense that the torque and the play and the repetition of the language is part of the thinking and does something for the thinking. And I think if it is indeed true that Black life exists in the impossibility of the modern world, there's always a trying to figure out, well, how to articulate that impossibility. And that's why I think so much of these literary works, I believe that there's a kind of philosophical overture or posture in them, because there's work to be done, because it's not a given. Lucille Clifton's poem, the poem looks clear and simple, but there's a thing that happens in trying to say, how do I attend to this again and again? And this is, I'll say this last thing, and then I'd be happy to have you push again. I was last week, I was trying to say something very much like this about In the Wake, and I think I was understood differently than I mean. Sometimes when I teach a work like In the Wake, it's frustrating because the students come in thinking they've already got it. You know, they'll say, "Oh yeah, Professor Quashie, let me in that class, please. I read In the Wake work." Right? Or they do this with Venus in 2 Acts too. There's a joke to be told about a student saying, "Oh, you're teaching Venus in 2 Acts as 11 moves. Ask me about that later and I'll tell you." And so I pause. I said, no, wait a minute. If you look on page 9 and you think about the 2 different kinds of repetition that are working on page 9, you understand more deeply the compoundedness of how temporality is working in that project. And so I think part of it is, maybe it's the slow. Maybe, Bob, it's the slow. There's something about, to go back to your original phrase, aesthetic education, there's something about the slow. I've been rereading some Kierkegaard because I almost want to, I think I want to make an explicit move about literature and theology in regards to Black literary studies. So that's one thing I might say in response to your question.
Just a very quick follow-up, the emphasis, 2 thoughts, reference to the slow resonates with some of what, Nahum Chandler has talked about and written about, which is the importance of patience. But I was also in reading, and often he's talking about reading Du Bois. But I was also struck by your use of the word surrender in your discussion of the Black sermon, and so you talked about surrendering, to the sermon. And so one thought is, well, how do you put surrender and patience together? I mean, I wonder if implicit here is also a certain notion of receptivity and responsiveness, that one has to be open. And you use the figure of openness. So one has to be open to being affected and claimed by the text. That I take it would be a kind of a presupposition of the sort of surrender that you're talking about, and at the same time an expression of a certain sort of readerly patience.
Yeah. I would concur with that. And again, maybe I'll go back to the Spiller's essay. There's that essay, moving on down the line, is fantastic, and I could talk about it it's in my mind now because I'm trying to think with it recently. But there is something about in the instance that Spiller starts, she walks into one of those magnificent old churches in Europe, and she's taken by the fact that the architecture does this work of subjecting the ones who are there for service, right? That the architecture is so overwhelming, so beautiful. The visual architecture does this work. And she says, of course, when she thinks back to the more modest, the kind, I think she calls it the church of the dispossessed in her home community in the South. She says, these are small churches that were built by local people. And so the architecture doesn't have that capacity. Instead, what produces that capacity, that sense of taking over the attending one, happens through the sermon, through the force of the sermon.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, at the part of, to take the church metaphor as far as I want to take it, when you walk in then to the church, you are saying, this I will do. And so as you say that thing about the surrender and the patience, part of it is maybe the acquiescence is not the right word, but I can only think of surrender now because it's in my head. The sense of, I'm here to do this. I'm going to be with this poem. I'm giving myself over to this moment. And that full of all kinds of risk and tenderness and complicatedness. But I think that's a part of it. And I would say, again, thinking about your work on Du Bois, especially in The Shadow of Du Bois, part of what I appreciate about that book, and part of why I think I want to borrow and modify the phrase politics of expressive self-realization, is because you spend time thinking about how Du Bois spends time thinking about and revising what becomes for him a politics of expressive self-realization.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a practice of patience, and it lives in all of the great philosophical traditions. And for me, I think those traditions also live in the poetry of someone like Lucille Clifton.
Yeah. SAIDIYA, you want to jump in?
And I think I'm gonna shift on a detour. I do want to just like bracket, the kind of the religious and theological overtones that we've hit here, because in the book you use terms like, holy work. You echo Moten talking about, wanting to be called. There is a language of beholding that also has this kind of, religious undertones too. So I want to ask you about that later.
Okay.
But I just want to start out, just really, you're such a beautiful reader. And just the pleasure of reading along with you as a poem unfolds and opens up, is a great pleasure. And, I guess this is my third time reading Black Aliveness. And there's a different question that I have here now. And I guess I want to maybe pose it in the form of a paradox. And it's something that I'm really kind of grappling with too. And I guess maybe I would ask you to speak to something like the robustness and the insufficiency of the aesthetic. And I, would say something like, the robustness, because the Black text enables us to imagine, a Black world as totality, which suggests, this incredible robustness. And I think that I understand that because I think a lot of the work of the Black aesthetic is involved in a project of diminishing and provincializing whiteness, diminishing and provincializing, throwing into crisis the givenness of the world. So on the one hand, that's its robustness. Then there's something though that I would, and insufficiency is a kind of placeholder for this thing, which is, why do we have to, why is it necessary in a way to bracket anti-Blackness when thinking about that work that the Black text does? Why, there's a way that within that textual world, anti-Blackness and the worldness and its givenness is, surpassed, exceeded, bracketed. And for me, that seems to speak to a kind of, the insufficiency of the aesthetic in meeting that. And for me, this isn't a question of either or necessarily, but just to kind of speak to both of those dimensions. And then I have like something that falls from that. But I would love to hear you, you know, to talk about that.
That may be right. The insufficiency. I find myself, as I think about I'm thinking about work now around the phrase, here is the hour, here, H-E-R-E, partly because I want to think a little bit about here as a Dexis term, as maybe the gesture that literature makes. And then I want to think about synonyms of here, such as metaphors of hand in literature. So in Wayward Lives, there's that stunning prose poem, manual, hands show up in Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture, et cetera, et cetera. But part of the turn, and this is where, Bob, your the first part of your question was made me think that you clearly understood some of the work I'm trying to do now, is maybe I'm trying to sit with the disciplinary specificity and disciplinary limitedness of literary study. And maybe I'm trying to figure out what all I can gain from deepening that specificity, like the attention to close reading as a literary practice. I want to be clear too that I've spent a lot of time thinking about like the nonsense of new criticism. New criticism doesn't own, right? The close reading doesn't belong to new criticism. There are traditions of close reading that extend beyond the criticism. So there is a sense of insufficiency that I can't argue against or find a way out from, which might also be part of just the limitedness of my own, right? This is as far as I have gotten. But I will say, to go to Venus in Two Acts, one of the moves I've tried to, I don't know if you all can hear the ding on my computer. I've tried to quiet text, but somehow I didn't do it well. So I apologize for that. Near the end of that work, you write, I can't remember the full phrase, but it's something like, we must bear what is difficult, or maybe even impossible to bear, the image of Venus in chains. And I hear in that phrase that, for me, that's the 11th move that this essay makes, right? And that sometimes students miss its complicatedness because some of its moves are implicit, like the reference to Foucault is implicit, the argument about history as a priori versus history as a posteriori is implicit. I hear in that move a sense of what do we do when, with the fact that are trying to orient even to the stories and histories that are of us or of people like us. What do we do when that orientation reaches a limit? And I don't have a better answer than that. I reckon aesthetics can't do everything. And yet I think maybe it does a little something. But I'll think about that more as a way to have I mean, I can think of examples of things I might say to students in classes. Very, very quickly, I'll say one more thing. In that terrible summer of 2020, which could represent many terrible summers or many terrible months, I remember talking to undergraduate and graduate students as we were all trying to figure out, how do we orient ourselves to this world? Should we be outside in the streets? What does it mean to be trying to prep for field exams and so on? And there was something meaningful for me in thinking, well, if I'm spending time with the encounter with this text, I might be learning something about how to spend time in the encounter when I step out the door of my office, or in the encounter when someone comes to my office in a way that feels less than embracing. And I don't know how to explain the relationship or the calculus between those two things, but maybe because literary study and reading is such a place that I have made myself, right? That sense of self-making, that I don't know how to explain that calculus any better, but I also recognize its insufficiency.
Yeah, and I guess, kind of follow-up question, which is something I'm really grappling with now, particularly as it is about the entanglement between the political and the aesthetic and certain kinds of representational projects. And for me, much of the mood of this book, which is a mood that I inhabit a lot, is the mood of the subjunctive, right? And so I want to ask you about this relationship between the potentiality of the subjunctive and the as if and what that affords, but the relationship between that as if, or the fine line, or the entanglement, or the risk of that as if becoming disavowal. And this is a question of, and I guess I'm thinking about, a disavowal of a shorthand, a disavowal of the structures of anti-Blackness, a disavowal of like how deeply they inhabit us, right? And so, for example, someone like, Calvin Warren might say that, wanting to implot a Black subject into a certain narrative of the human, is a disavowal of the problem of ontology. And I was thinking about that. So it's not, because it seems that in the book you walk this very fine line between saying like, oh no, it's not about saying, in any way putting into question at all the matter of anti-Blackness or anti-Blackness as a structure, but it seems that part of what the Black text or the aesthetic affords is a line of flight from that, right, for you. And so, but there's that relationship between the as if and disavowal. And I was thinking about, if there isn't an aspect of disavowal that is like necessary to a certain kind of Black existence. So I think that's the way in which it's not simply like, subjunctive good, disavowal bad. And this question came up for me, seeing actually a production of Claudia Rankine's work, Help, at the Shed, and seeing this kind of enactment of this like anti-Black world, and being in the theater watching a show with 11 white actors on the stage with one Black female actor, and really like recoiling from it, feeling the shock of it, feeling the danger of it, and thinking like, oh wow, like, oh, that's not what I want in the theater. That's not what I want for my aesthetic. And I think partly that it seems that what the aesthetic has enabled is a kind of, a language of thought, a capacity for thinking critically about an anti-Black world, but while diminishing it, while making it provincial, while trying to contain it, even if only, as an imaginative capacity. So that's really, it's that relationship between, the as if we might live when we can't, and this, disavowal. And we might say, I could be provocative and say one claim that you make about the Black text and its capacity is that it affords such a disavowal.
I think there's so many things that are running through my mind. You mentioned Calvin Warren, and Warren has a brief piece on a religious studies forum. I won't be able to remember the name right now, but he starts the piece with what type of life is possible without metaphysical guarantees? And he uses that, what type of life is possible without metaphysical guarantees? And so he's using that as a kind of invocation to think about theological posture, right? That the practice of faith in some ways does not offer metaphysical guarantees, and yet people try to enact, people find ways in religious practices, religious communities to enact faith. This is a very simplified version of what he's arguing, but I find that question to be really useful. And so as I hear you, I think disavowal, yes, but also the way that, and I'm trying not to turn to particular aesthetic representations. Like I immediately want to turn to Toni Morrison's character Sula, who for me is you know, it feels as if Sula was written for and about me, which is the beautiful thing about aesthetics, right? Because there's this incredible over-identification I have with a character like Sula, who is indeed a Black woman, and I am not a Black woman, right? And so there's something about the aesthetic calculus as one that allows me as a reader, if I'll just take the young boy reader that I was when I encountered Sula, there's something about that possibility and also the failure of it, that I was not Sula, could not be Sula, certainly did not act and don't act now in the world as Sula does. I think there might be a way that the aesthetic as a space of encounter can also withhold the failure of its promise. That's one thing I might say. There's also, I might want to play with the as if, the as if that's subjunctive, and then the as if that's a little bit vernacular. The kind of, you're walking towards your seat at the US Open, and you imagine that someone is sitting in the seat that's yours, and it becomes this kind of like this, almost like, I wish that would happen, right? So that's another kind of as if moment that has in it not just retreat, but a sense of manifestation of force. But maybe the last thing I will say, again, recognizing that I'm one of those people who will tell you up front, I find poetics to be absolutely necessary, and I don't find it to be completely satisfactory, right? That I find thinking about the poetics of being necessary, but it only does so much. The last thing I would say is that word here. Lucille Clifton has a number of poems where she uses that word here. And one of the things I love about the indexical quality of here is that it has both an imprecision, right? That if I say here, it instantiates something that's at the same moment immaterial. But then I think about Bill T. Jones's iconic dance performance of Still Here. And there is something about it that is something about the word here, about Celie saying, I may be Black, I may be poor, but I'm here. There's something about that articulation as a rhetorical and therefore as an aesthetic instance that is not disconnected from embodiment, and therefore not disconnected from the social world, and therefore not disconnected from the political reality. But there is something about, if literature enacts a kind of praxis of here-ness, and if close reading enacts a kind of practice of here-ness, then what literature does for me is that it makes me more astute to being here, more astute to the trembling and the tech, right? Maybe that's one of the ways in which it may not be sufficient, but it can help me practice other modes that might get me closer and closer to sufficiency. And if maybe in another instance, I might say something about the political and trying to remember that the political really is also a domain of thinking about how the social world is organized such that we might be together, how the space through which we make grievances about our being together, and wanting to distinguish that sense of the political from the undeniable politics that's at heart in any kind of aesthetic work, right? I think that's part of what I sometimes struggle to articulate well also. Go ahead, Saidiyah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was just like, with that here, and it was interesting. It's like, the here that's then, there's the embodiment, which then connects us to the social and then to the political. For me, the power of that here, I agree with you. It has so much force. And in the case of, both Celie and Bill T. Jones, it's a here-ness that at the same time articulates, the force of death. Like, oh, for Jones, like, I am still here in the context of, the AIDS epidemic, right? Like, I'm already consigned, I'm the already dead, but I am still here. And Celie's here too, like, its force, its beauty, its power is because we are hearing it also speak to, again, not as protest, not as opposition, but certainly as registering her disposability, her fungibility, her utter valueness. So I just think that those moments may be closer, more entangled for me. So again, it's not about that, that the aesthetic transport takes us away from that, but its ability to both articulate it and then also try to orient us toward it in a way that might enable us to survive. So it's like, it would be that degree rather than, a countering of it. It's just about, it's the immediacy of that entanglement.
Could I just pick up a little bit on this conversation to get, I think, perhaps at the same point? It struck me reading the book how often you use language of moving beyond or surpassing. You suggest that to call into being a Black world is to move beyond, to surpass a terror or anti-Blackness. But at the same time, in your remarks earlier this evening, you were using the figure of a reckoning. So in some sense, there's a kind of paradox that maybe pointing to that those two terms capture. In other words, how can a movement beyond be at the same time a reckoning with? Because you might think that a movement beyond is a leaving behind, and perhaps a form of disavowal. But you want to say, well, it's not. That wouldn't be quite right, because it's also a reckoning with. And you can't reckon with if you've left behind, unless you just simplistically define, leaving behind as somehow a way of reckoning with. But I take it by reckoning, you have in mind a kind of engagement with that. It's not simply a leaving behind. So there's a kind of paradox, and perhaps the challenge of your thinking is to try to kind of get clear about that paradox and how it works.
Yeah. I think this idea, and Bob, the productiveness of thinking of this paradox is indeed why I am continuing to think, if not on this precise thing, right? Thinking about here, thinking about the disciplinary practice of close reading. Maybe I don't know if I can. I'm going to try to say this thing that I think Saidiyah might resonate with the last comments you made about, say, Bill T. Jones and Celie. and why I'm pausing on it is because it's a comment about death, and I am I'm in a space of grappling with death as a reality in my world, my family life. There might be then more than two, but at least two that I can recognize, registers of trying to reckon with death, right? There is, for one who's Black in the world, the always of that threat, of that reality, of the very constitution of Blackness as a term of death, which one might even say it's a thing that surpasses the consciousness of the one who's Black, right? And by surpasses the consciousness, I mean it doesn't only require one to acknowledge that ontological force is there in the world, for that force to shape and try to will the will of one's life. And I think there is also what one might call the ordinary reckoning of death as a thing that manifests as a fear, whether it's Kristeva talking about the fear of abjection, right? As a thing that recognizes, that organizes itself as a fear or a threat of disappearing or a threat of being lost. And I don't know if I can disaggregate those two, and I'm sure there's more than those two. And I don't know that it's even possible to say, well, when and how is it possible for a person who's Black to have an ordinary relation to the human or animal threat that death is on and for the one who's human or animal, right? I don't, so I wouldn't presume to say that I can disaggregate it and say I'm gonna create this space where then all of the encounter with deathness or the threat of death is only about that ordinariness and not about the kind of enduring spectacular that is anti-Blackness. And so in a way, yes, in a way, trying to set up an aesthetic term of in a Black world, perhaps I may seem like I'm doing that, but I would hope too that in some of the text, in Lucille Clifton's text, in my suggestion of the reading, that there's a way in which the threat of anti-Blackness is not outside of what texts sometimes consider. What's outside of what I am trying to set up with that wish clause is a sense, I don't even know how to, I don't know how to finish that clause except to say that nothing is antiseptic in the text or the moment of Imagine a Black World. Indeed, Imagine a Black World maybe opens up a possibility to engage more difficultly with the difficult things. But I accept that there are at least two and maybe more than two scales on which death as an idea, as a threat, as a reality, visits itself upon every person who's Black, and Imagine a Black World does nothing to undermine that truth, you know. But it is it is a paradox, and it's a paradox that continues to motivate me as I try to find a way just to think and study and think some more.
So I don't know if we should open it for questions. I mean, I wanted to say something about, Black death and, a certain, and this other like the and Christi, like the a kind of like a fear of death or dread of death that may define the human. I mean, I think in terms of the space, you know, that I'm, you know, thinking of, and when I think of that entanglement or that proximity, it seems that Black intimacy with death, and this brings wake work back into it, is also what's, you know, engendered these rich cultures of death. What, you know, someone like Vincent Brown might call a mortuary politics, Christina Sharp, wake work, and that is the sense of, you know, we think of the Society of the Boa Morte in Brazil, that the whole notion of our intimacy with death also has cultivated this culture too of a good death, right? Of an anticipated death, of a welcome death. So it's also created other kinds of dispositions that are distinct from a certain, I think, you know, ideational construct of Western man. And, you know, I don't know if you know that John Berger has a great essay, Thesis on the Dead. He says, well, you know, it's only at a certain point in time that we understand ourselves to actually be separate from and distinct from the dead. And I, you know, I mean, I think that what your work does so implicitly, you know, and again, and I almost feel like I would say, to push it, I would feel like maybe you're misdescribing what your work does with the language of is that it's what a certain kind of dispossession might actually afford. And this is not a romance of death. This is not, but to say what it means to be dispossessed from a certain, you know, taxonomies of value, a certain classificatory schema, that it might afford something else. And I feel that in your attention to the Black text and poetics, that's exactly what you are like illuminating. You know? And I'm thinking about that, you know, like in the domain of social practice or social poesis, but it's really like, you know, what has actually been afforded by not inhabiting certain categories, by not being legible within a certain framework. And that's a kind of like a come celebrate with me as much as the fact of our survival.
I can't, thank you for, I didn't know that John Bircher reference. As you were naming social practices, I thought about Second Line in New Orleans culture. And then I thought about Sula, right? Because I think about Sula often, but both the character and the book. And I think about Shadrach and Sula as characters in that book who, through, I'm going to use the language you use, through a kind of inhabitants of dispossession, free themselves in regards to the anxiety of death. And I think it is that. I think if I think about the bottom or medallion in Morrison's novel as being, having a kind of Black world character, and if I think about Sula's consciousness and Shadrach's consciousness, Shadrach, certainly his consciousness is formed by a kind of extreme and repeated encounter with the terms of dispossession, both in terms of his having fought in the war, his injuries, etc. And Sula, who also early on is encountering the kind of intense terms of dispossession that are her legacy as someone who's Black and female in that world. Both of them have a relationship to thinking about death that I wouldn't say surpass the particularity of the discourse of Black death. Indeed, it is animated by their encounters with what we might call, right, the discourses of Black death. But it's that, and not but, and it is that other thing. It is the world of how they then think about what it means to exist that that I find compelling. And it does resonate. One of the things I find so useful in the wake is that book, amongst many things, is asking us, so how do you live with this? And so maybe it's just a matter of that I start in an oriented place. I wanted to start with Imagine a Black World because I wanted to suspend for a moment death thinking so that I could say, what are the dynamics that are happening in these texts as they think about aliveness? But that the paradox of it remains, and it is there in works that I'm reading in the text. But maybe I'm approaching it from one edge or one angle of the line, and someone else is approaching it from another. I see that Mabel Wilson has appeared.
I have reappeared. This is phenomenal, and I did not want to interrupt, but we actually do have questions that are coming in the Q&A. So I just wanted to give an opportunity for our audience to ask questions. I mean, I have questions, but Kevin, I'm just going to email you my questions.
Okay.
You can comment. And your reading of the Clifton was incredibly beautiful, and just the reading really brought other insights about that work, actually, that I've been thinking about in my own practice. I just want to start in the Q&A. And again, SAIDIYA and Bob, please feel free also to respond and chime in, I think, to these questions, because they're also addressed to some of the topics and subjects you brought up. Calandra Warren just wanted to say, Dr. Quashie, not a question, simply a thank you. Absolutely breathtaking. The next question is from Olivia Pearson, who is actually one of our MA students here at Columbia, who writes, "It is an absolute pleasure to tune into this talk, and I've been waiting in anticipation. You write and speak extensively about the influence of the Black women writers and Black feminism has had on you. I'm an MA here at Columbia who is doing work on Black feminism as a source of spiritual guidance. Can you speak about your thoughts on the relationship between the two, the spiritual, unbound by institutions of religion, and Black feminism?"
Those kindnesses are unsettling, so I will just lean into the question and say, I wouldn't want to say that only Black women writers do this, but there is something about, imagining something else to be that seems to be a deep part of Black women's writing practices. And because Black women also live and have relationship with people, with other Black people who are not Black women, I think that we might be able to say that those, if we call them conjuring practices in a kind of broad use of that term, are part of Black women, a Black cultural legacy that we might be able to trace to Black women's discourses. So yeah, I think, I can't help but just think about iconic titles of works by and about Black women, or moves philosophically that Black women texts make that are about imagining something else to be, right? Which is, and they're riffing on Lucille Clifton's iconically untitled poem called "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" And so I think, for me, I remember as a young person, maybe this is not the direction that the question was asking, but I remember as a young Black queer child in an immigrant family, trying to navigate the discourse of Blackness around me, the discourse of Blackness that I felt that empowered me, and also the parts of it that troubled me. And it was largely Black women writers, especially writers in the 80s, thinkers, I should say, in the 80s and 90s, whom I thought were trying to deploy Blackness in a way that felt like it gave me a practice of how to deploy it. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say in terms of religion, let me see if I can call up the chat, because I've now call up the Q&A Unbound by Institutions of Religion and Black Feminism. Well, I mean, I think Hortense Spills' essay, right, when she talks about those two, the differences between those two traditions of church, right, the European and Western church, which has a certain kind of architectural practice for engagedness. And then she talks about the church of the dispossessed. And I think when I say church and say religion here, I really just mean theological. That is, I really just mean any discourse that is trying to invite one to think about notions of the spirit broadly. And that too is part of Black cultural discourse broadly, and especially part of Black women's cultural discourses. Someone like a character like Maud Martha becomes a spiritual character by virtue of the attendedness she tries to make to how she's living her life. If we think about attending to the how of one's living as the essence of what a spiritual practice is, or the essence of a theological practice, right? I'm now thinking a little bit of some of the great iconic theological texts like Kierkegaard's writing. If part of attending to the subjectivity of one's experiences is what a theological experience is, then it seems to me that there's that there is embedded in a lot of things that Black women thinkers write, what we could call a theology. And of course, there are womanist theology and other things like that, more formal traditions. So that's one way I would respond to that question.
And can I pose a question to Kevin? Just on that note, just on a point for thinking, because, you know, there's, you know, there is, and I don't know if you would recoil from this, I mean, there's a kind of, I would say, I would describe it as a vitalist politics in Black aliveness too. And that vitalism, you know, can have a theological undercurrent as well. So there's a way, you know, is it that, you know, that we find certain things in Black women writers as much as there's a kind of a confluence of interest between, you know, your own theoretical aesthetic predilections and then the writers that meet that, because I would say that there's a certain kind of aesthetic object that is especially, you know, kind of like ripe and generative for you. And you yourself describe the poems as spare, because that spareness is about, I think that, you know, the matter of being, the there-ness, the lifeness, the so I don't know, I don't feel that you're like offering a general description of something like what Black women writers do.
That's right.
Much as this set of writers
That's right.
speaks to a certain set of concerns that are very close to you.
That's right. I picked a particular canon. I continue to pick a particular canon, and maybe an inflection of what I was trying to say. There is that moment, I won't remember the exact phrase now from Noam Chandler's X, but it's he says, we cannot pretend to speak of these things. This is from the very beginning of X, the problem of the Negro as a problem for thought. And I think there's so many, this is where I might say, yes, I've picked a particular canon. And I also think that there is something about how we think about Black writers writing or Black thinkers thinking that becomes a kind of encounter with the existential possibility and impossibility that is a Black writer thinking, or a Black person thinking, or at least that's part of what I read in the provocation of the opening of Chandler's book. And so I think those two things might be two different articulations of a kind of theological overture, if I'm now using theological to sit next to the idea of the philosophical. But yes, the canon, I have picked a very specific canon, And it does a certain kind of work that articulates and speaks through a kind of spirituality. And I wouldn't want to claim it as representative of the totality. And I'm also interested in, though I'm not in this book, I'm also interested in thinking about what's the line from the County Cullen poem? The thing about like, I can't remember. It's bid. Yet do I marvel, the County Cullen poem, the very end of Yet do I marvel, which I can't now recall precisely, but there's this kind of like existential philosophical overture of like, what has the world done to make me Black and then bid me to sing? There's something about that sense of the writer, the thinker, as realizing writing practice as a kind of reckoning with whatever it is that Black being means and can mean in an anti-Black world. And I think both of those things are next to each other. Does that make sense, SAIDIYA?
Yes.
So I'm going to, I think, go on to the next question. And this person, it's Callaloo, who asked, and this is a quote, "What I want is the freeness of a Black world where Blackness can be of being, where there is no argument to be made, where there is no speaking to or against an audience because we are all the audience there. And as such, the text's work can manifest an invitation to study and to becoming for the Black one." And the question then is, I was wondering if perhaps Professor Quashie could comment on how they read the above quote in conjunction with the beautiful and capacious proposition of the as if of such imagining.
This goes back to SAIDIYA's and to Bob's SAIDIYA's question about the paradox and SAIDIYA's notation of the subjunctive as an implicit and explicit rhetoric in my writing. So it says what I want, right? It doesn't say what I have. It doesn't even say what I believe will manifest. And I think that's maybe for me, the encounter with literature, or maybe the encounter with all writing, or maybe the encounter, all writing by Black writers, or maybe the encounter with all writing, or maybe the encounter with all art is another chance for me to deepen that practice of, maybe I wouldn't say the word freedom, but maybe instance of freeness or instance of suspended in a moment. And so I think in trying to read literature deeply, and when I say literature, I don't only mean creative works, right? Again, this is the point for me in teaching. I should just say this very quickly before we run out of time. I was teaching Venus in 2 acts one time, and students were, as I had said that they were doing with In the Wake in a different context, they were like, yeah. We've read this in many classes, Venus in 2 acts, The Trouble of the Archive. And so I paused and I said, because I'm laughing because I'm prone to make dramatic and ridiculous statements in class. I said, there are 11 moves Venus in 2 acts makes. We're going to track those 11 moves right now. Now I pulled 11 out of the air. I had not gone through and cataloged the essay as I have with something like Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury, where I will number the paragraphs and ask each student to be responsible to a paragraph so that they can spend time trying to attend to what seems like a simple argument or an argument we think we get. Well, so at the end, we ended up with, of course, I made it work because I said 11, so we had 11 moves, and so the joke became Venus in 2 acts in 11 moves. There's something for me about, this goes back to Bob's question about close reading. There's something for me about the practice of close reading that not distracts me from, not takes me away from. Maybe it is a deepening of a relation of being in the world, even though one might say, but you aren't quote unquote in the world because you're just reading. And I think there's something about the phenomenology of reading, as people have talked about it, the phenomenology of the encounter of being oriented via an object, which is one of the ways in which we could read Venus in Two Acts as an essay, or one of the ways we can read the opening of Scenes of Subjection, where there's all this attentive to how are we invited into these scenes, which is almost literally, SAIDIYA, what you write on the first page of the book. I find that to be productive for thinking about Black study, and for thinking about my Black inhabitants in the world, though it may not work for someone else's inhabitants.
Mabel, could I ask one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I've been struck by your recurrent references to Kierkegaard. And as you might guess, I mean, I don't know why I didn't think of this before, you know, I was immediately put in mind of Kierkegaard's Either Or, which is structured around the relationship, perhaps the opposition between the aesthetic and the ethical. Mm-hmm. This may be another way of getting at, the paradox or the paradoxes we're talking about. But you might think that for Kierkegaard, the modality of the as if of the subjunctive is the modality of the aesthete, right? Whereas the ethical is about a certain kind of a centeredness that's at odds with the with the irony and with the subjunctive and with that we associate with imagination and more generally with Kierkegaard's aesthete. So I wonder, is that a useful point of reference or something that's been in the background, and does that complicate? I mean, maybe I'm just kind of catching up with you. Maybe you've been thinking about this with reference to Kierkegaard and Either Or all along, but I'm wondering if that's a kind of significant point of reference for you and points to another dimension of perhaps the paradox of reconciling the beyond with the reckoning, the aesthetic, the imaginative, the subjunctive on the other hand, with kind of ethical being in the world.
I would say that's accurate. I love the modality of the aesthete. I love the crispness of how you describe that. There's a Canadian philosopher whose name I won't be able to recall right now, who has an essay, it's from the 1980s, that talks about the argument over Kierkegaard's, the idea. Kierkegaard wrote a small early paper thinking about subjectivity and truth. The idea of subjectivity is truth. And this Canadian philosopher, it's an essay that I had read, a paper that I had read, but I'm not sure I would have understood it as well had I not spent time reading with this philosopher who walks through the ways in which Kierkegaard is really thinking about the subjectivity as a kind of practice, to modality, Bob, to use the word you use, subjectivity as a kind of practice that possibly brings the one to an experience of a true thing, not truth in the Enlightenment notion of the term truth, right? So it isn't some version of the kind of very unsettling reality we are living in now, where truth is being questioned, that Kierkegaard means to use subjectivity as a kind of modality. And I find that really compelling. I will never write about Kierkegaard. I've been revisiting Calvin Warren's work. I realized the other day, oh yeah, Calvin Warren cites Kierkegaard. And so maybe there is a cohort of us who are like just finding different coordinates or plot points for trying to think through our different encounters with thinking about Black thought. But I would say yes to your question, and maybe Kierkegaard will make a bigger appearance in my thinking about the indexicality of here. You're muted.
I unmuted myself. There is one more question about this, the paradox, and it's from Tanya Foster, who writes, must the paradox be resolved? To what extent does the Black text create a space on the edges of legibility as articulated by the limits of certain rhetorics?
Well, therein is one response. I mean, I was just thinking as I was assuming we were going to close about how wondrous it has been to have this exchange with SAIDIYA and with Bob, and also with Mabel, who I've had other interactions with, that each of us in our work are doing different things maybe around the same object. Or if I can invoke the late Toni Morrison from her conversation with the late Gloria Naylor, where Morrison talks about that she hadn't read Zora Neale Hurston, but when she went back and read Hurston, she recognized that they were engaged in working on the same diamond thing, but maybe they were just working on different facets of it. And though I would never be so unaware to imagine that, right, that the thing I'm working on is a diamond thing, I think we are approaching these questions. This is the beauty of Black study. And indeed, the paradox doesn't have to be resolved, but I'm also grateful for the way in which SAIDIYA especially has highlighted it, because it allows me then to think in the new thinking I'm doing about how I can be clearer about the limits of the study, such that the study that I'm doing can be clearer, richer, perhaps more useful to people. So the paradox doesn't have to be resolved. I'm really glad to have a more astuteness about the paradox.
Thank you, Kevin. And also thank you, SAIDIYA and Bob, I think, for a really wonderful, thoughtful, generous conversation. And the book is really worth reading, because you're literally reading with Kevin. I mean, that's what I think is really amazing. And the fact that you said these are particular texts that I've pulled together because they're important to me, and you sense that because you say, you say this constantly in the book, I love how this is doing a certain, and you don't usually hear that in literary studies. And there's a kind of joy that we experience with you in the engagement with these texts. And, I really want to say thank you for that work.
Thank you.
So I also want to thank our dedicated colleague, Sean Mendoza, and also Sharon Harris, who's done a really amazing job in coordinating and bringing this evening to all of you. A thanks goes out to Colby King, who is our assistant. And also, if you've noticed, we've had these really great ASL interpreters, Amber Bertelut and Lisa Weems, who've been a part of this evening. So I wanted to thank them as well. And I want to say, and this is a really, really great way to, I think, conclude this academic year of programming, precisely because of these urgent questions, I think, that the work asks, and also this conversation asks. I mean, in terms of what we're all encountering and thinking through in our personal, intimate lives, but also our institutional lives, our public lives. And, I hope that everyone really takes away aspects of the conversation that they can bring into their own work and practice and thinking. But I do want to say, please see our website for events that we co-sponsor. There's an ICLS annual conference tomorrow all day, and you can find it on the ICLS website with a concluding keynote by Denise Ferreira da Silva, which I think will be fantastic. And also there is an event this weekend by the Zip Code Memory Project that includes a number of folks involved in that, including Fred Moten. So please see our website for further information. We have thesis presentations coming up, spotlights on students and faculty, and that can be found at afamstudies.columbia.edu. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Bob, Kevin, and SAIDIYA for a really, really great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you
I
so
want
much.
to keep talking.
Yes, more soon.
Okay, then.
Be well, everyone.
Okay, good night.
Night.